Hello and welcome to News Central Now. I am Adebola Adedugba. Let's begin by telling you that a federal high court in Abuja has struck out the case against persons charged over the nationwide End Bad Governance protest. The trial judge, Justice Obiora Egwuatu, on Tuesday struck out the suit following application by the Counsel to the Attorney General of the Federation, Mohammed Abubakar, to take over and discontinue the case. The Attorney General of the Federation, Lateef Fagbemi, who was represented by Director of Public Prosecution of the Federation, Mohammed Abubakar, had at the proceedings announced the exercise of his power of Section 174 of the 1999 Constitution to take over the case from Inspector General of Police. After granting the request by Justice Egwuatu, the AGF proceeded to request the invocation of the same section of the Constitution to discontinue the trial of 119 accused persons. Meanwhile, the Inspector General of Police, Kayode Egwuatu, said he has summoned senior officers, including all DCs, CID, and heads of investigation units over the welfare of younger protesters identified to be minors while they were in police detention. This development comes following a nationwide outrage over the arraignment of the minors at the Federal High Court on Friday. The protesters, who were charged with treason, looked malnourished when they appeared in court 3 months after they were arrested during the August hunger protest. However, a statement released by Police Public Relations Officer ACP Olumuyiwa Adejobi in Abuja on Monday night said Egwuatu had ordered a thorough investigation into how the minors were treated. When I head to the U.S. for our continued coverage of the 2024 U.S. election, voters in the U.S. hamlet of Dixville Notch launched Election Day in the first minutes of Tuesday with a tied vote, mirroring the incredibly close national polls in the White House race. Kamala Harris and Donald Trump each got 3 ballots in a tiny community in the northeastern state of New Hampshire, which for decades has kicked off Election Day at the stroke of midnight Monday, hours before the rest of the country's polling stations open. Democratic Vice President and Republican ex-president have been battling in a tense and exceptionally close race, with opinion polls largely tied. To a gathered crowd of journalists, the vote opened with a rendition of the U.S. national anthem performed on accordion. A recent leisure poll published by the New York Post reveals that U.S. Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump and Democratic candidates Kamala Harris are locked in a close race ahead of Tuesday's election, with each securing 49% support. Only 2% of respondents indicated they would vote for another candidate. Both Trump and Harris are viewed as equally capable of enhancing America's quality of life, each receiving a 44% approval rating. However, Trump leads Harris in terms of his clarity of economic strategy, with 45% support compared to Harris's 42%. The poll, conducted between 31st October and 3rd November among 950 likely voters, has a margin of errors of 3 points. The New York Post, owned by Rupert Murdoch News Corporation, endorsed Trump for president in late October. Earlier, Jim Clancy, American broadcast journalist, shared his thoughts on the election.
The election itself is a matter for Africans to take an interest in, and that is this debate. You know, the founding fathers in the United States didn't really know what kind of a government they were going to end up with. They had been, of course, living under a monarchy. They didn't want that. But they went to study Greece and Rome, ancient cultures and civilizations, to see what is the best form of government. Democracy, it was decided strict democracy in the Greek sense, only really existed and worked in small states. And the United States, even at that time, was a sprawling nation set to get nothing but bigger. And so they ended up with Ben Franklin's.
And to talk about the U.S. elections, we're joined by 2 ladies. Laurie Ladd, world affairs commentator, and Esther Krakwe, British broadcaster and columnist. Let me start with Laurie Ladd. Given the tied vote between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, what implications does these have on the race itself?
So difficult to tell right now. We've covered a lot of close elections, but my gosh, this one really is too close to call. I think the one thing that we can be sure of is that we won't have a winner tonight. Back in 2020, we didn't get the winner until the Saturday after the Tuesday elections. I'd expect we may even be a little later this time around. So I think you and I may be talking a number of times over the next couple of days.
How about unique voting timing for those in Dixville Notch at midnight? Do you think they have anything to do with trends in early voting across the country? Will this have any impact whatsoever on voter turnout as well as engagement?
It's an excellent question. I think Dixville Notch is more a curiosity than anything else. It doesn't really have much predictive power. I'm happy to, and as you said earlier, the vote in Dixville Notch was tied, 3 votes apiece after a painstaking tally. Happy to hear that it doesn't sound like either candidate has demanded a recount there. But you have touched upon something that I think will be very important, and that's the presence of early voting. We're getting indications that record numbers of Americans have voted early, and a lot of the pollsters are sort of struggling to figure out how to account for this early voting. Almost half of Americans voted ahead of Election Day in 2020, and there's every indication it could be more this time around. So that is very difficult to account for in the polling. The Democrats are saying that early voting tends to favor them, but I'm hearing some Republican pollsters say that they are seeing a higher incidence of Republican registration. A lot of people trying to infer things from this, but I do think it could skew the polling. So the polls that we see now may not accurately reflect voter sentiments.
Well, let me get a perspective of Esther regarding tied vote between Kamala Harris as well as Donald Trump. Do you think this would have any impact whatsoever on the election, in totality?
This is the thing, it's difficult to kind of gauge where the election is turning because of the rise of early voting. You don't know the actual decisions that were imperative that people made before they cast their vote. So, you could have people that have voted early that could potentially have swung their vote a week later if new news comes to light, or if different factors have changed, or maybe they have looked at the polls and think, actually, this candidate doesn't really stand a chance. So this is one of those unique circumstances that because we have such high incidence of early voting, we have actually really high incidence of Republican early voting, which is bucking the trend because it's not the norm. Usually Republicans vote on the day. They don't really have a high turnout when it comes to early voting. It's really, really hard to tell. And of course, this election will come down to a handful of swing states. And even then, gauging the actual data is different, not just because, they all have sort of different rules electorally, but also because different districts manage their voting processes so differently. So not only are we going to get the results quite later on, but it's really, really hard to gauge. That's why the election seems to be on such a knife edge.
How about the endorsement we've seen, particularly that from the New York Post of Trump, influencing voter behavior? Do you see that happening anyway? Such endorsement from them? Do you see that influencing voter behavior in favor of Trump, particularly undecided voters?
Well, the question is, how much do endorsements from various media outlets actually impact the voter? So to put it bluntly, how many voters are sitting there waiting for the endorsement of the New York Post or the the New York Times or whatever publication to actually cast their vote? That's very dubious. I think in this election, there are very few undecided voters. Most people have made up their minds way before whichever celebrity or media outlet endorses whichever candidate. The peculiar thing, though, is that there are many outlets, about 200 of them, that previously endorsed Biden that have taken a step back and have decided to remain neutral this election, all of whom are American media outlets. I mean, in Europe and Britain and Europe, like The Economist and all of that, we've expected loads of these publications have already taken a position. But actually, a lot of mainstream media outlets and magazines and publications in the US have decided to take a step back. Jeff Bezos' organization, for example, being a case in point, which is peculiar because these publications have a history, a track record of endorsing candidates. So it's really, you have to question the motivation behind that. Is it because the media landscape has become so fragmented that whoever wins, they don't want to necessarily have pigeonholed themselves to one side and effectively hemorrhage viewers and an audience? Or is it because they really don't see the point of endorsing anyone? It's actually affecting their credibility and neutrality. So this is quite a game changer election, not just in terms of the candidates, but also in terms of how it's influencing the media landscape and the decision that these executives are taking.
Laurie, what's your line of thought in terms of demography? Do you think that would, that should be examined in the poll results to better understand, support levels for Trump or Harris?
Well, I mean, Esther has made a really good point about endorsements. And I think we've had a lot of discussion about endorsements this time around because of Jeff Bezos, who owns the Washington Post, which has tended to be a left-leaning publication. He came out and said, we're not going to endorse anyone. We think voters can make up their own minds. And there's some sense to that, although a lot of people wondered whether Jeff Bezos was looking at his bottom line and looking at, his business interests and wanting to stay on the right side of whoever gets elected. But you mentioned one thing I'm fascinated by, and maybe Esther has some thoughts on this because I'm not very hip or trendy, but the prevalence of celebrity endorsements for Kamala Harris. We've had so many Hollywood figures, Oprah Winfrey, Taylor Swift, coming out to endorse Kamala Harris, these well-known names. And I can't get my head around whether this will make a difference, particularly with younger demographics. These are the flakiest of voters. Joe Biden, bizarrely, for the oldest president we've ever seen, did very, very well with younger voters, better, in fact, than Barack Obama did. As these voters are flaky, will they come out or not? Are they influenced by these celebrity endorsements? And on the other side, do people who tend to support the Republicans feel almost talked down to by what they consider to be elites, telling them how to vote? So I'm of two minds on how these endorsements can work. Maybe they cut both ways.
Let's talk about timing. Looking at the timing of the polls, we've seen one conducted just days before the election. Do you think that would affect responses of likely voters?
I'm sorry to jump in here. I think Esther really hit this very well. And there are big questions about how these polls will affect people. And will people look at polls? And they are quite tight, but different polls in different states may say something different. Do people say, I'm turned off by the whole process, I may not go? How does polling affect turnout on the day is a very, very big question. I think another thing to be aware of this time around, and it sounds a little bit like I'm digressing a bit, but I think it's quite important. There are 10 states in which there'll be abortion rights, reproductive rights on the ballot. Now, I'm not sure if polling will accurately reflect people who may go out, may be completely turned off by the political process. And I'm getting the sense anecdotally, there are a lot of people who feel that way, but they may be sufficiently concerned about reproductive rights to go to the polls and simply vote on that referendum. Two of these referendums are in swing states, Arizona and Nevada. And I'm wondering if polling will reflect people who go to vote on reproductive rights, and when they get into that booth, decide that they'll check a box for a presidential candidate, even if they weren't inclined to do so when they went out, when they got up in the morning to go vote on reproductive rights. It's not clear to me that polling will accurately reflect that little wrinkle in things.
How about you, Esther? What are your thoughts on timing of the poll? We've seen one which was, conducted just days before the election. Do you think that's, that has any impact whatsoever on responses of likely voters?
I think it really is probably going to follow the trends that have already been established in the past, which is that the kinds of voters that Republicans tend to galvanize, which is white, blue-collar, working class, predominantly men, they are the hardest to poll, actually, just because they don't really respond to pollsters. I mean, I would be interested to look at sort of the data and statistics around poll fatigue. How exhausted are Americans of this process of constantly being called up by pollsters, having months and even years of campaigning and different media sort of stories stories shoved down their throats. I mean, it's quite a contrast to many countries in Europe that limits their electoral campaigning to basically 6 weeks and have some sort of cap on the amount of money you can spend. There have been billions spent in this campaign alone. And, you know, yes, it's understandable a country the size of basically a continent having so many electoral processes and having to vote for so many offices. But there is an element of fatigue there. So I think that the trends that we see will hold in terms of polling. So the more likely Democratic voters, the women, particularly urban women and all of that, they're more likely to respond. So that can skew a lot of the data, which is why sometimes you hear pollsters talk about hidden or reluctant Trump voters that just don't engage with pollsters. And so it's really hard to engage. I just wanted to make a quick point on the celebrity endorsements. It's also interesting because we don't actually have any studies, recent studies, to see how celebrity endorsements actually impact voter behavior. Again, the ultimate question is who sits there waiting for the endorsement of Oprah Winfrey or Taylor Swift to cast their vote, bearing in mind these people live completely different lives from the average person. So the outcome of elections will likely not affect their lifestyles in one way or another. So it's quite interesting. I mean, you know, we've seen Kamala Harris basically shrouded in celebrity. She's had every big name under the sun basically come out for her, including previous Republicans like Dick Cheney. But, you know, Trump has gone kind of the average man route, has really been galvanizing the internet, particularly male-dominated space, and has been kind of going after many celebrities in that field as well. So, you know, I personally am dubious of the efficacy of those sorts of methods, because I think actually voting patterns are deeply personal. People tend to vote on their top three priorities, which it would seem in this election are the economy, immigration, and somewhere down the line is probably reproductive rights. So it'll be quite interesting to see where the whole hidden voter or the people that just don't engage with pollsters will fall, whether they'll break more on the Democrat side or the Republican side.
Well, indeed, thank you so much for your time on the news. Esther Krakui, a British broadcaster and columnist. Many thanks indeed. I will still stay with you, Laurie Lade. Right now, let's connect with our correspondent in Washington, D.C. That's our chief international correspondent, Afia Hagen. Afia, just paint a picture for us of what's happening where you are. Are people out there voting?
Well, it's 30 minutes until the polls actually open here in Washington, D.C. The sun is just coming up, so it's all quiet here at the moment. But yesterday really was a day of the city getting ready for the election and getting ready for potentially impending violence. You know, Washington, D.C., quite quiet, shops being boarded up throughout the city. Remember, this is the capital of the United States, so quite unusual to see. You know, it's a city really bracing itself. But like I said, 30 minutes until polls open in Washington, D.C., and we will surely be out there for you.
Well, talking about those who have come out to, you know, cast their votes, how would you describe the demography of those who have come out today?
Well, what we're really seeing from early voting, and I believe the last early voting numbers I had was about 80 million people have cast their early votes, and that's over half of the 150 million people that are expected to vote. And what we are seeing, especially across swing states, is we are seeing much more Republicans voting than early voting than before. About 36% of Republicans have used early voting. That's up from about 30% in 2020. We're seeing a lot more older white women using early voting, around 54% of early votes as well. And I think we will be seeing in this election a record amount of early votes cast. Will that mean that we get a later result? We're not entirely sure. Perhaps it may mean, I mean, in 2020, we had a lot more mail-in votes, and that meant that it took a lot more time to count the votes, which is why it sort of took 5 days to get the result. But what we are seeing from early voting in record numbers, and more people, more older white women, more Republicans voting early than ever before.
Afia, I wonder what your thoughts are regarding the timing of polls. I mean, we've seen just before the election conducted, people casting their votes already. Does that in any way affect responses of likely voters?
Well, it can do. I mean, I think Laurie made a really good point earlier on, as did Esther. You know, is that people might think, you know, if these votes have already been cast, does my vote count? How does the polls affect how people feel about voting today if they haven't voted already? I think undecided are no longer undecided. They would have made up their mind by now. And I think polls, you know, they don't always get it right, do they? Sometimes they get it very, very wrong. And especially Trump supporters are underpolled. They're shyer about telling pollsters or anybody who calls from this newspaper, that newspaper, or that polling company who they will vote for. So I think, yes, perhaps we can look at the polls this year. Apparently they have been adjusted to try and include more Trump supporters and try and be more accurate and reflective of that. So perhaps we can look at the polls where they are now, and they are pretty much in a dead heat and have been for such a long time. So perhaps we could look at them as accurate. And I think, you know, the polls definitely affect the way that people will think about the election, but also affect the way the candidates and the campaigns will go about the election as well. I mean, the Trump campaign have been really, really optimistic, perhaps until this week, and insiders in the Trump campaign, you know, muttering things like the bottom has fallen out of the campaign, that they're not as positive as they were perhaps 7 days ago. The Harris campaign always remaining cautiously optimistic. I think one phrase that he used was nauseously optimistic as well, trying to keep humble and remaining the underdogs throughout the campaign.
Well, thank you so much for bringing context to this U.S. election happening. Our chief international correspondent, Afia Hagen. Let me come back to you, Laurie. I mean, we've seen, towards the build-up of this election, various campaigns. Today, seems to mark the D-Day. Let me get your perspective. If these election swings either way, for Trump, if he emerges the winner, what should we expect, for America and the world at large? If it swings in favor of Kamala Harris, what should we expect for America and the world at large?
Excellent question, particularly because both of these campaigns have been very, and to my mind, frustratingly light on policy, particularly economic policy, which is one of my specialties, but also what voters tell pollsters consistently that they care the most about. And there's a funny dichotomy going on here, because Americans will tell pollsters that they feel pretty good about their financial situation, that they feel optimistic, their finances are in good shape, in as good shape as they were 4 years ago. They also tell pollsters that they feel that the economy is not doing well. So it seems quite inconsistent, but it feels like particularly the Democrats have shied away from economic policy. And when Kamala Harris has discussed economic policy, she hasn't looked particularly confident. Donald Trump has talked about it a little more, but mostly in the context of Kamala Harris broke the economy, she caused inflation, which is completely nonsensical. I think both of the candidates, let me turn this around. Neither of the candidates is what would be considered a free trader. Both Donald Trump calls himself tariff man. He wants to put tariffs on every import that comes in to the United States. Bizarrely, this argument plays very well with the electorate, despite the fact that ultimately tariffs make goods more expensive, and that's reflected in the price that consumers pay. They tend to be inflationary. A lot of Americans tell pollsters that they don't want any more inflation. Kamala Harris has been a little bit quieter. She has talked about perhaps fighting inflation by investigating whether supermarkets are artificially raising the prices of things. That's also a nonsensical argument. There's very little evidence that that is happening. But she has not talked about, Joe Biden kept all of Donald Trump's tariffs from his first term. Harris has not talked about rolling this back. So this age of globalization, of free trade that has helped so many countries, including a lot of African nations, it's not going to ground to a halt, but it will certainly make it more difficult for countries to trade with each other. And of course, developing nations, trade has been the way that developing nations have gone from poorer countries to middle income countries. We could see definitely a halt to that process.
Well, thank you so much for your thoughts on the news, Laurie Lade, World Affairs commentator. Many thanks indeed. Thank you for staying with us. The Parents Forum of Lagos Model Colleges held a peaceful protest at the governor's office in Alausa, Ikeja on Monday. Parents are objecting to the state government's imposition of a termly burden fee of 100,000 naira and are calling for immediate reversal. Our correspondent, Omolola Ololade, has details.
chanting solidarity songs, holding up their children's uniforms and bearing placards with slogans such as 100,000 is suicidal. Parents of students at Lagos model boarding schools are protesting against the recent fee increase.
What started as a peaceful protest has generated into something else, causing a whole lot of traffic on Alausa Road here in Lagos. As you can see behind me, and on the other side of the road is a whole lot of traffic. Now, these are parents of children in model schools here in Lagos. They are protesting against the increase in their tuition fee, which is from 35,000 naira to a whole lot of 100,000 naira.
It's after paying the money, 35,000 naira. So the last day for us to now resume, you extended the resumption again. After the resumption now, a week, you didn't say anything. So the last day, on Friday, 8:30 in the evening, they now send a letter to us that they are increasing the money. Where do I get the money from?
When we pay the boarding fee of 300,000 per session, 100,000 per term, the implication is that we're still going to spend so much, so many other amounts of money. We're going to give stipends to our kids. We're going to buy provision for them. We're going to always see to their welfare from time to time. The implication is that it does not stop at that. By implication, we're going to be spending 500,000 per session per child.
My daughter has been at home. Last week, we are here. We have been coming, and government is not telling us anything.
The chairman of the Parents Forum, Lagos State Model Colleges, Dakpo Dawudu, said beyond seeking a fee reversal, the school should establish a boarding management committee to promote financial transparency.
They had to set up the boarding school management committee, which hitherto had been there statutorily in the Ministry of Education, which all the principals refused to implement. There is supposed to be, but they have refused us to participate in it because of the inherent corruption in it.
Despite being blocked by security from entering the governor's office and the Ministry of Education at the Lagos State Secretariat, the parents remained determined to have their voices heard. After hours of protesting and causing traffic along Alausa Road in Ikeja, representatives of the Lagos State government responded by calling a meeting with stakeholders to discuss the issue.
He not only sent to us, he sent the whole cabinet to us, led by Chief of Staff, Town Planner, Tayo Ayide. And you just saw him. He came to us and we've addressed them. We've passed our requests on to them, and they have further requested that we meet up tomorrow to iron everything out.
Parents rejoiced at the progress made, and it is hoped that the meeting between Lagos State government and the Parents Forum executive will yield positive results as they have resolved to put the protests on hold. In Lagos for News Central, I am Omolola Ololade.
5 Nigerian boys rescued from a human trafficking ring in Ghana have safely returned to Lagos and paid visits to News Central studios. The ordeal began when Daniel and Zeal, 2 teenagers, were lured to Ghana under false job promises but were instead forced into cybercrime. A distress message they managed to send led to a swift rescue operation by News Central in collaboration with Ghanaian police. Now 5 Nigerian youths and a Ghanaian were freed, while 2 suspects are now assisting in the investigation. News Central's Bernard Akede has the full story.
Another case of young Nigerians misled by promises of better prospects abroad, only to be trafficked and coerced into illegal activities.
I went to his room and I saw lots of money on the bed. He told me that he recruits people for an acting job. So due to the fact that I have gone for a shoot before, like I've acted in some movies before, so I felt, oh, okay, this kind of person. So I took my friend along. I asked my friend to come with me. So getting to the venue, they said the venue has been changed to Ghana. So on reaching Ghana, we were blindfolded and forced into a house. Then from the one, we've been beaten thoroughly.
We went to the house. 3 days after, the next morning, he beat us, and then with a cutlass forced us into a parlor like this. and they gave us the laptop. We should learn this online scamming something. I was not like, I was good at computers, stuff, IT, because I learned it. So I was like, why are we supposed to do this thing? And each time I had that kind of question, he always beat me. Like, okay, I said, okay, let me just for calm, let me do this thing to avoid the beating or something.
The story came to light when News Central's investigative reporter received the SOS message and immediately took steps to locate the boys.
We had their parents who were part of a fellowship on the island, crying out to their pastor, who in turn got across to us to say, I have some of my members who are looking for their kids, and they had history. That place had a history of people being trafficked from that place in the past. So, Ikota, in Ikota, Lagos. So, on arrival, of course, at Ghana, they had seized all mobile devices on them, and so, but they were given the laptop with which they were to work. So that was how he was able to log into his sister's Instagram and send the sister the message and said, we're in Ghana, I don't know where, but it's a house, several rooms. We were locked in one of the rooms, we were being beaten.
Families of the boys were distressed upon learning their children were missing and out of Nigeria. One mother expressed frustration after receiving limited assistance from the local police in Ogombo.
The information we had is that they got somebody, an agent, taking 5 children out of the quota. Then they caught the person and that we should go and look if it's the one. And when we went there, they said we should pay 10,000. We don't have 10,000. We give them 2,000 naira. They then went and showed us the man was saying he is not the one. We said, okay. They started pushing us. Okay, we should go, we should go, we should go. You know, maltreating us badly. We lived there. Even the second time we went, please, we want to this report this, they refused. I kneel down and beg them. Even the woman was saying, is it only you that is widow? Me, myself, I'm a widow. Other people are widow in Nigeria.
With crucial support of Ghanaian police, the boys were eventually rescued, and the reunion with their families was filled with emotional moments as they returned to Nigeria.
When News Central TV came to our trouble, when they came to us, we see there is hope in them. And that hope, we have witnessed it with our eyes by seeing our children. They are alive. News Central. In fact, God Almighty will continue blessing them for what they did in the life of our children. From all the way from Ghana, they went to rescue our children, and all the money they spent by rescuing our children, God Almighty will replenish them back.
The management of News Central expressed relief over the boys' safe return, stressing that many others remain trapped. It also called for urgent actions to address the factors making young Africans vulnerable to traffickers.
Young Nigerians are in a dilemma. They're in a dire strait, actually, at the moment. And it's extremely important that the media will not only speak for them, but give them a platform to speak for themselves. We give them a platform to voice their worries, concerns, pains, trauma that is created by the economic situation that is leading them to want to get out of the country as quickly as possible. It is that desperation that has led to the 2 young men who now turned out to be 5 young men, the oldest of them being 24 years old, the youngest of them being 17 years old. These are young people that should be either in university or just coming out of university and looking for a job the way some of us were able to look for a job 20, 30, 40 years ago and get one. But what we can do is to create situations that enable some of them to get rescued, brought back, given the opportunity to voice their concern, and hopefully find a job in the process of expressing themselves and showing the talents that they have so that they can find people that will assist them.
For these boys, the experience serves as a sobering lesson. Efforts continue to identify and apprehend those involved in the trafficking ring with hopes that others still ensnared may soon find freedom. In Lagos for News Central, I'm Bernard Akede.
Let's take a short break. When we return, Nigerian shippers cancel pushes for port regulatory bill. Details shortly. Join. Thank you for staying tuned. The Africa Energy Week is taking place in Cape Town from the 4th to 8th November. Now, this annual event brings together key stakeholders from across the continent to discuss critical issues surrounding energy production, sustainability, and investment in the energy sector. The event will have several panel discussions and workshops throughout the week with topics that aim to highlight the energy sector and the need to create more inclusive opportunities. And joining us live from the event is News Central's Director of Programs, Adebola. Adebola, it's good to have you join me on the news. Just bring us up to speed regarding events playing out, today. We understand it started yesterday. Today, 5th November. What's been the highlight so far of this event?
Thank you so much, Adebola. So yes, the event did start yesterday with some pre-event workshops and technical sessions, but really kicked off today. We had the executive chairman of the African Energy Chamber, that's NJ Ayuk, opening the ceremony and opening the event proper today. And it's been quite interesting. If I'll go straight to my highlights, the highlights I have for you is the announcement of the establishment of the Africa Energy Bank by Afri-Exim Bank. So that is a bank that is going to focus on trying to close the financing gap for many African countries and many African companies as well that are in the oil and gas sector. So that announcement has been made. It's a very big one for us here because part of the issues that many African countries have been having, and even their national oil companies, NOCs, has been a conversation around a lack of financing for the investments that they want to make, for seeing them move into renewable energy. So that's one of the highlights of today's event so far. Another one has been the fact that there has been a lot of conversation as to how these situations continue to have African countries invest in oil and gas, wanting to continue to drill, baby drill, as NJ Ayuk would say, but also with conversations around climate change, just energy transition, and how that will play into everything. So those are a few of the things that we've seen. We also know that a very big one for the African Energy Chamber is the fact that they signed a deal with S&P Global this afternoon as well. So there are going to be a lot of conversations around what that means for African energy companies, for the oil and gas sector across the continent as well. So it's been really good. We've seen the Minister of Petroleum Resources, Minister of State for Petroleum, and that is all. That's Honorable Hanneken Lukubiri. He was here today, had an opening session, also was on a panel with several other ministers from across the African continent. As of right now, he's in a closed-door section with the president of the Afri-Exim Bank, Benedict Orama. So those are a few things that we've taken away from today so far.
Considering we're talking about, investing in African energies, how would you describe the presence or turnout of African countries at this event, today?
It's been really a magnificent turnout. People are here. There are going to be specific events later on starting today that talk about investing in specific countries. Nigeria is on the table and on the spotlight as well. So conversation around investing in Nigerian energy. We have that also for Angola. You have it for a number of countries that are represented here. Oil ministers, gas ministers, major players, both international oil companies and national oil companies, are also well represented here as well. So a lot of conversations, hoping to see more deals signed. There are 4 deals signed before, which of course includes the S&P Global deal with the Africa Energy Chamber that I mentioned earlier. So we want to believe that by the end of the few days of this 2024 session, we'll be seeing more deals signed and many more people walking away with some level of financing, technical support, or whatever it may be to be able to push forth the oil and gas investments in their countries.
Well, thank you so much for your detailed coverage, and that's our Director of Programs, Adedugba, giving us, up to, date correspondence regarding the 7th Africa Energy Week happening live in Cape Town. And that's all on the news. You can watch News Central live on DSTV, channel 422, Star Times, channel 274, Avo TV, and YouTube.